Hello and welcome to the channel. My name is Matthew King and this is the Music Professor channel, which I'm introducing tonight with Loki, my faithful assistant. Loki's had a haircut since the last film, so he looks a little bit different, but he'll be on duty. Tonight I'm picking up on some topics that were discussed in the last video, which was about Mozart's last year, 1791, and that centred on the story of the music that Mozart wrote for glass harmonica that year, and also on the Magic Flute and the story of that year. One piece that I discussed very briefly was the little choral motet Ave Verum Corpus. And I thought for tonight's film, we'd focus in on that piece. Let me read from a fascinating book called Mysterious Mozart by Philippe Soler, the French novelist. And it's a fascinating book because it's not a standard biography. It's not a standard work of musicology at all. It's more of a sort of cultural discussion about Mozart. And in it, he writes this just short description of a meal that Mozart had with Haydn in December 1790. Soler says this: "What would have happened if Mozart had been able to reply favourably to the invitation he received just then from the Italian theatre in London? Haydn will actually go. There is a farewell dinner in Vienna. The two friends are moved. They'll never see each other again. However, there is a miracle. As if resuscitated, Mozart will experience the greatest creative year of his life. In this again a mystery, 2 string quintets, the most beautiful ones, a piano concerto, the Ave Verum, 2 operas, including his greatest masterpiece." I presume Soles means the Magic Flute rather than La Clemenza di Tito, although that's very good too. "The concerto for clarinet, the unfinished Requiem, which had to remain unfinished. What a year of music, what a year to die." So, rather poetic description, incredibly concise, speculative description of that year. It's sort of summarising events at that point in Mozart's life in quite an intriguing way. So he contrasts the fact that Mozart had received an invitation to come to London from the Italian theatre in London. And I've always speculated how extraordinary it might have been if Mozart had taken that invitation, gone off to London that December, ended up in London, not got the disease that killed him in Vienna, and lived happily in London for however long, becoming rich and famous. Isn't that an interesting story? Because that's sort of what happened to Haydn. Mozart and Haydn were friends. They always spoke warmly of each other. Haydn said to Mozart's father, for example, I'm quoting this as I remember it, he said to him, "I tell you before God, your son is the greatest composer known to me." That's an extraordinary thing to say about a colleague. Mozart said equally generous things about Haydn, so they had a mutual appreciation. And the night that Haydn left Vienna in order to travel to London in 1790, he was 59, so he was getting old by the standards of the period. They had a meal together, and Mozart is said to have shed a tear and said, "We'll never see each other again," to his old friend, because Haydn was going away for a year or two. And they both assumed that Mozart was talking about the possibility that Haydn might die while he was away. But of course that didn't happen. Haydn went to London, had a whale of a time. I mean, he worked incredibly hard, but he made a great deal of money and became very, very famous in London, which was the sort of commercial centre of the world at that time. It was Mozart who died tragically in 1791, a year after that meal together. And when Haydn heard the news in London that year, he was devastated. In fact, he wrote to a friend to say that for quite some time I was beside myself with grief. So it was very difficult for him. Mozart had always been, I guess, a rival for him. He'd felt that, and it's galling, isn't it, when you're a young, capable artist and you find that there's somebody much younger and apparently more brilliant. That's a difficult thing to cope with, but that's something that Haydn did deal with, and he dealt with it very graciously. As I said, tonight's discussion is primarily focused on the motet Ave Verum Corpus, and it's a very tiny piece. Mozart wrote it in June 1791, so 6 months after Haydn had left Vienna, while Mozart's wife Constanza was taking the waters at a spa called Baden by Wien, a spa near Vienna. Mozart went to visit her there. While he was there, a friend who was the church organist in Baden asked him for a motet for his church choir, and Mozart duly produced this masterpiece. A wonderfully concise, elegant, simple piece. Not elaborate, not for a cathedral choir, but for a church choir to perform, on a regular Sunday, which in fact was what it was. It was commissioned for Corpus Christi, which is a church event. And the text that Mozart set was the Ave Verum Corpus, which is an ancient liturgical poem about the body of Christ. So absolutely suited to the church festival. So I'm wanting to think about how music is a spiritual or a purely emotional tool. We all know this, but how does that operate, and how does Mozart operate in that realm? Of course, his music is perfectly poised, perfectly balanced, perfectly structured, incredibly architectural, but it has this spiritual character, this wonderful elevated character. When he wants it to be, he can be a show-off, he can be enormously cheeky, he can be tragic. And in this respect, he is a bit like Shakespeare. And I think maybe all creative artists have to be like this, in the sense that Shakespeare could inhabit any character he wanted to, even the biggest villain, even Macbeth. Shakespeare becomes Macbeth in order to write Macbeth, in order to make the character real, human, even to the extent that we can empathise with that character. It's the same with Mozart. He has to inhabit the mood, the spiritual character of the thing he's doing. If he's writing the Magic Flute, he has to become Papageno, or he has to become Sarastro, or the Queen of the Night has to become the Queen of the Night in order to make that character real and meaningful. So here he's putting on an aspect of himself that he took very seriously. The church composer, the composer of liturgical music. He said to Constanza that being a church musician was what he was best at, which is a funny statement because, of course, we all know that Mozart was, well, probably the greatest opera composer in history. Of course, there are many great opera composers, but Mozart's certainly up there with the best of them. And, of course, he's pretty good at writing quintets and symphonies and string quartets and piano concertos and clarinet concertos and everything else. There's no genre, in fact, that Mozart didn't excel at, and that's quite rare for any composer. You think of Beethoven. Beethoven never really conquered opera. I mean, he had a go. He wrote Fidelio, and it's impressive, but maybe not the greatest opera ever written. It's hard for composers to excel at everything, but Mozart managed to do so. Right, well now the Ave Verum Corpus is a beautiful piece. It's in D major. It's the simplest thing. It's written for strings, and they begin with this two-bar introduction. Mozart excelled at this kind of beginning. You may remember the beginning of the 40th Symphony, almost unplayable on the piano. There's this figure on the violas before the melody comes in a bar later. So it's this skill he has of starting the atmosphere first, the groove, if you like, and then the music. That's actually unprecedented in the 18th century. No one did that, except Mozart. Mozart's last piano concerto does it as well. You hear the accompaniment, and then the melody comes out of the accompaniment. So it's a trick of his. So we start with this beautiful, just strings moving up, no melody, just a rising figure. Then the chorus comes in with the main theme, 8 bars. So first of all, Ave Verum Corpus. So that means hail, true body, born of the Virgin Mary. So it's a reference to Christ, the body of Christ. Let me just say, by the way, it doesn't matter whether you're a believer or whether you're not a believer. We don't really know about Mozart himself. Was he a believer? Wasn't he a believer? But what we do know is that when he's writing the Ave Verum Corpus, he's a believer. He believes the text to the extent that he's able to set it in this sort of miraculous way. So we've got Ave Verum Corpus. So, hail, true body, and And this is the simplest thing. The wonderful stillness of that second phrase, which is a homage to the mother of Jesus, the Virgin Mary. Now, second phrase, almost like a second subject. It's located on the dominant. Truly suffered. Beautiful little interrupted cadence. Immolatum is the word. Immolatum, which means sacrificed. And then on the cross for humanity. In cruce pro homine. So now, here's this beautiful moment where the word crucified is set not in a theatrical way or a melodramatic way, but simply on this climactic rise of a fourth, the held note hanging. The rhythm of it's terribly important. Everything's suspended. You know it's an important note. He isolates it in the choir. It just pings out. And here's another thing. In cru, the voices underneath go in, and then as they move to cru on the A major chord, the note, the D, hangs over as a suspension. We call this a suspension. So what did harmonise with the chord becomes dissonant with the shifting harmony, and you're left with that yearning effect of the D then falling down. And in that gesture, Mozart represents the emotional depth, the idea of Jesus crucified for humanity. And then the orchestra. Now, third phrase. We move into the third phrase. This is almost like a development section. This is where the harmony gets weirder. So we have the text, which is also stranger, is from whose pierced side water and blood flowed. Again, a reference to the crucifixion and the moment when the spear was thrown at Jesus' side and water and blood came out. Now, in Christian doctrine, that moment is considered to be the sort of birth of the church. The water and blood of Christ has enormous symbolic meaning connected with the Eucharist. And of course, the Eucharist is what this hymn is all about. This is the hymn that's sung as people are going up to receive communion. So here's the moment then where we sing about this, from whose pierced side. So we started on the dominant. Mozart moves to a diminished chord. So already there's a question there, isn't there? And then something fascinating happens, because no other 18th century composer would do this. You'd expect to fall back to D, or possibly to D minor, but that's not what Mozart does. Diminished chord, and then sudden shift to F major, the flat submedian, really quite remote from the home key. So let me do that again. From whose pierced side? Perforatum, pierced side. And then the water and the blood flowed. G7, that's that's the dominant of C, but he doesn't take it that way. He turns it back towards D minor, the tonic minor, with these wonderful chromatic bass notes. So isn't that magnificent? The whole thing is so effortlessly judged. I'll just play that phrase. Final phrase, almost like a recapitulation, we've returned to D major, which is in itself a surprise. You're expecting D minor, but it's D major. And this is where it becomes personal. The text says, "Be for us a foretaste of the heavenly banquet in the trial of death. So this is about us. How does any of this refer to us, all this stuff about pierced sides and stuff? Well, this is what it is. And Mozart sets it in this such a simple, touching way as a little canon, upper voices, lower voices. So it's women's voices, men's voices, and it's just a sequential canon. And then you expect it to finish, but it doesn't. He elides that cadence and pushes it to the subdominant. Wonderful moment. Do you remember that moment earlier on when we had the crucifixion was represented by the rising fifth? Okay, here at the end, the interrupted cadence, and the jump has gone up another tone, so it's now a fifth. It's a higher jump, it's more climactic. And the word is in death, the trial of death. In mortis examine is the Latin. In more, all on its own, death, on its own. The high G, shift to the minor, and then away from G minor. So initially it's this dark moment, death. But then Mozart takes us, he sidesteps chromatically to that extraordinary sense of consolation. Chromatic drop again. And the cadence. I mean, how extraordinary is that? Let me do it again. All the more extraordinary because Mozart is writing about how this idea of the body of Christ will be a source of comfort in the trial of death. And what's moving is that Mozart himself, within 4 months, will face that trial. So that is the setting of the Ave Verum Corpus by Mozart. Now, the next part of the story is to now step forward to the 1860s, which is 70 years forward from the death of Mozart. And in 1862, Franz Liszt has a look at this wonderful piece, the Ave Verum Corpus. And Liszt is a wonderful guy. He's not only a composer of extraordinary gifts, he's also the greatest pianist in the world. But he's given up his rock star lifestyle, performing the piano all over Europe and running off with aristocratic ladies and all the rest of it. And he has decided to put it all aside. First of all, to become a conductor in Weimar in the 1850s, and then subsequently he decides to move towards religion. And he takes holy orders in 1865 and becomes Abbe Liszt, a sort of ecclesiastical title. He wears black robes and he can even officiate at services and things. So what an extraordinary character, because he really does have that rock star tendency. And I always think that these different stages of his life, these sudden about faces, these changes of career direction are all slightly theatrical. Nevertheless, there's always sincerity because Liszt is a deeply thinking person. But I also think that there's a sort of celebrity edge to all his decisions because, you know, he's an attention seeker. Anyway, that's beside the point, really. It's also genuine. He has this sort of deep religious conviction. And he's very interested in the idea of reviving and changing the church music of the time. He's at the Sistine Chapel in Rome, and it inspires him, going into the chapel, inspires him to write a new piano piece, which is called À la Chapelle Sixtine. In other words, to the Sistine Chapel, as he dressed to the Sistine Chapel. And it's a fascinating piece because it's not original Liszt. It's not music that he himself has composed. He does something very audacious, which no one now would do, but in the 1860s you could get away with it. He mixes together two arrangements. One is an arrangement of Allegri's Miserere, which is this fascinating piece that belonged to the Sistine Chapel. And sometime I'm going to do a film about it because it's this extraordinary piece. I won't do it now, And I'm not even going to play it. I'll tell you why in a minute. But anyway, in this composition, he arranges Allegri's Miserere, and he sets it in this completely crazy, sort of diabolical way, and alternates it with this very pure setting of Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus, arranged for piano. So you get the Allegri Miserere, which is all sort of blood and thunder and wild arpeggiation, and then he interleaves it with these beautiful glimpses of a sort of heaven as represented by Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus. What's quite moving in the piece is that both pieces are connected to Mozart, because Mozart, when he was 14, went into the Sistine Chapel, heard Allegri's Miserere, remembered it. Imagine this. He heard this entire choral piece, logged it in his memory. No one had access to the manuscript at that time. And when he went back to his hotel room that evening, he wrote it all down by memory. The 14-year-old Mozart wrote it all down from memory. And when the Pope heard that Mozart had done this, he gave him a sort of holy order, the Knight of the Golden Spur. So it was considered almost a miraculous thing that the boy Mozart had done. Liszt knew that story, and I'm sure in some very Lisztian way, the piece is a sort of biographical look at Mozart. You've got Allegri's Miserere, which is the cause of this sort of extraordinary thing that Mozart when he was 14. And then you've got this beginning of life at 14, end of life represented by the Ave Verum Corpus. And Liszt also wrote about this, the misery and anguish of humanity, moan in the Miserere. Allegri's Miserere is all about sort of crying out for the forgiveness of sins. And then Liszt says, God's infinite mercy and his hearing of prayer answer and sing in the Ave Verum Corpus. This touches upon the most sublime of mysteries, which reveals us that love triumphs over evil and death. So there's a sort of typical program, a 19th century romantic religious vision there, combining Allegri's Miserere with Mozart's Ave Verum Corpus. Now, this is a piece that he wrote in 1862, as I said, but then he detached his version of Ave Verum Corpus so that it could stand alone as a piano piece. And that's the version that we're going to hear now at the end of this discussion. And all I need to say is that Liszt's version is beautiful. He adapts it for piano so skillfully, so sort of artlessly, so that what is originally a vocal composition becomes a very lovely, singing, rich sounding piano piece. Liszt was a very, very brilliant. He could reconceive things in terms of piano sonority like nobody else. And it's always a bit of a miracle the way he does it. So you'll hear him transform Mozart's music into a piano piece. He partly does it by changing the key. What was originally in D, a simple key, he transposes up a sixth, so he lifts it higher. It's in B major, a more complex key, and more elevated up on the piano so that it sounds sort of angelic. It's kind of kitsch. This is romanticism reimagining Mozart, a sixth higher and a bit more angel-like, sort of floating from above. And Tchaikovsky in the 1880s, 20 years on from this, was so impressed by this version of the Ave Verum Corpus that when he wrote his suite, Mozartiana, in 1887, the centenary of the premiere of Don Giovanni, he wrote this wonderful orchestral suite, Mozartiana. He orchestrated Liszt's version of the Ave Verum Corpus. So there's a sort of story that's unfolding here from, Haydn and Mozart saying goodbye to each other, 1791, the extraordinary, the composition of the Ave Verum Corpus for Mozart's friend, Mozart's death, but then 70 years later, Liszt making his transcription, and then 20 years after that, Tchaikovsky making his. So you've got this beautiful sort of line running right through to the end of the 19th century. So Ave Verum Corpus, just a little piece that Mozart wrote one day in 1791 in June. He had no idea he was going to die that year. He was just passing through Baden. He wrote it for a mate. It was a simple thing. And yet it becomes this sort of iconic exemplar of genius elevated to the highest level, some kind of communion between genius and God, this kind of thing, which then becomes an iconic object and passes right through the 19th century and into the sort of mythology of Mozart and of how religious music even sounds. I think it's fascinating to think about these cultural histories. Anyway, enough talking. Enjoy Ave Verum Corpus by Mozart, arranged by Liszt.